In this video, we'll be talking about 3 different techniques. Last video, we should have talked about how to draw the birds and doing a wash. When you paint a very thin layer of paint, I watered down and made a shade of green and painted it all very lightly. It's not thick. When it's very transparent, that's called a wash. Alright, today we're going to be talking about dry brush technique and wet on wet. Start off with dry brush technique, you'll need 2 brushes. One that's dry and one that's wet. You're going to do dab, 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 just like that. And then you take your dry brush and you're going to swirl it to blend it together. Okay, never put this one in the paint. Always make sure you use the right one. So you have a wet brush. Dab, dab, dab. And then swirl it together with your dry brush. And this is called the dry brush technique. Alright, that's one technique. So far we have 2. When you have a very thin layer of paint that's watered down and you paint over the entire thing, that's called a wash. When you use 2 brushes, one wet and one dry, and you blend it together, this is called a dry brush technique. Alright, the next technique I'm showing you is going to be called wet on wet. I'm going to go ahead and wash this brush. Swish. Okay. For this one, we're going to be using 2 colors. We've used wet on wet with watercolor when we did the galaxy. It's a little bit different here. So you're going to start off with one color and you mix it on your palette. So I might do straight lines here. Instead of mixing the color on the palette, I'm going to take the white and go right on top of that and mix it as I go. This is wet on wet. One more time. I've got my dark blue. White. Keep on the tip. This is how you make the water. You don't mix it too much. You want to see the waves. So some's white, some's dark, and so on. Okay, moving on. Your bird is going to be a resplendent quetzal. So you're going to need green and then a little bit red right here. So go ahead and make it green. This is another example of wet on wet. Paint the whole bird green. While it's wet, I'm going to be getting a different color, most likely yellow. You can also use white for this or blue. And I'm going to be making texture. Texture is one of the elements of art. It's how something feels. I'm going to go in and add the texture of the feathers using that blue. Notice how I'm not mixing. I'm just putting the blue on top. If I had yellow, I do have a little bit of yellow. So what I'm doing here is adding texture. For the last step, you're going to be adding red to your chest. I'm prefer for you guys to wait for it to be completely dry. I'm a bit more experienced when it comes to painting, so I'm going to go ahead and do it now. But for this step, you want to make sure it's completely dry before you paint it red. I'm going to cheat a little bit. There we go. Okay. So to recap, in this video we talked about 3 techniques. When you paint very thin and water down your paint, that is called a wash. This gray part that we did in the last video was called a wash. When you use 2 brushes, one wet and one dry, that is called a dry brush technique. Okay? When you mix on your palette, that's called wet on wet. You're going to be using at least 3 different techniques that we talked about in this video on your final painting.